All right, we got time for questions. So if you can ask Dan a question, try to make your question as concise as possible, and then let Dan answer, and then we'll move on to the next person's question. Who's starting? Not everyone at the same time, please. Don't all speak at the same time.
Yeah. I would disagree with what you say. I think I'm something of an empiricist at heart myself. But just to what extent, when you have this belief and this philosophy, what's the danger of rejecting others and other beliefs? Right? They might be mythical, they might be spiritual, they might be intuitive, they might be counterfactual, this kind of thing. And is there a danger that we reject them, and that they may have found, I don't think I believe in smoking vulture meat either, or else, but they may have found that at times those did explain experience, those did predict consequences. Probably at times they did. And so to what extent do we resent, kind of one-dimensionally rejecting them and losing, like areas of experience that might have some value?
Oh, yeah, I think that it's different to say reject than to not accept. I believe that there can be value to something beyond whether it's true. And so, if you want to, I think you can be open to experiences without necessarily completely embracing the empirical truth of something. The thing is, our minds are the way they are, and for that reason, we can kind of enrich ourselves by embracing that aspect of ourselves, as long as we're aware of what that predisposition we have is. In other words, we have to first know, okay, I'm this way, this is how I'm built. And if I'm going to embrace this experience, it's kind of like Stephen was talking about last week with meditation. I think meditation can be an enriching experience. Partly because, in a way, it encourages us to be more objective. In other words, to kind of try to not suppress ourselves, but quiet ourselves so that we open ourselves up to the outside world. Okay? But, like he was describing, it can also become kind of a subjective kind of ego jerk-off. And in that case, you're sort of indulging the very aspect that you want to be trying to get away from. So I guess that's my answer to that is, we don't necessarily need to reject. We can embrace experiences for the sake of the experience. But if we're talking about claims of truth, then skepticism becomes important. And also, I think when we're trying to protect yourself, like I was saying before, for example, we're all skeptics when someone's trying to get our money. So I think that it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to, like, for example, I don't believe that skepticism necessarily leads to atheism. It can, and oftentimes it does, but it doesn't have to. Because, for example, spirituality is very enriching for some people's lives. I think it sort of depends how you're wired. Whether or not it turns out to be true, if it's enriching you, I think it can be a good thing. So, but if we're talking about humanity in general, you look at science and what science has done. In the last century, we've doubled the human lifespan from 40 years in that 1870 to, for men, coming up on 80 years now, for women more. I think the benefits of skepticism are demonstrated largely by science, because science simply does not work without skepticism. So, sorry, long-winded answer.
All right. Who's next?
not so much a question, an observation on yours. You talked about, if I got you right, some beliefs might work for some of the people some of the time. Smoking vulture meat might provide some meaning at some point for some people. A sort of little observation in terms of scientific knowledge, scientific belief. Then Newton's theory of gravity and motion was good enough for a time. It was good enough to put a man on the moon. As far as the moon, it was fine for those people at that time. It still is, it still works. But at a different level, at another time, intellectually, I suppose, at another space, another time, it's incomplete. So I'm not really drawing a comparison with Newton's incomplete knowledge with perhaps vulture smokers' incomplete knowledge, but it's just a thought that came to mind.
Well, I think that's the thing. The thing that I said, no matter what you believe, you should love skepticism. One thing that is to be loved about it is it tells us that our beliefs should be tentative and not dogmatic. So that means that if evidence accumulates, like the example I mentioned about Michael Shermer and the global warming thing, it's a very hard thing to put down our egos and sort of take our holy cow and set it aside. And sometimes we can kind of compartmentalize. And I think that's fine if you can do that. It depends on the individual. But the thing is, I think there's something beautiful about being open-minded enough that you hold your beliefs tentatively. And you actually grow with the new information, as you were saying with Newton and Einstein. Newton's beliefs were held by the scientific community practically as dogma for something like 2 centuries. And then you have this upstart, not only an upstart, but a German upstart. And when I say German, it's no joke. This was during World War I. We had a British scientist being challenged by a German, well, technically Swiss, but anyway, a patent clerk. And he was able to, not exactly upend, but to give a pretty hard shake to the quote-unquote dogma that physics had been based on for the past 2 centuries. And that is a perfect example of science, of the tentativeness of science. And the willingness to just say, oh, I really hate to do this, but sorry, I got to stick Einstein's bust up next to you and just go with the facts.
I think it's quite an interesting point you picked up with global warming. With Sherman putting his hand down and saying, look, global warming exists. But but we know now that, that's probably, there may be global warming, but the scientists cooked the books, haven't they? So, the ClimateGate fiasco where, universities were caught changing the figures or mixing the figures. Now we're not so sure. So my question is, my point is that another aspect of science, I'm with you all the way here, man, but one aspect which you didn't touch upon is scientists, there's a lot of bias in media. I think I've done some, for my master's degree, I talked about bias in media a lot. And so when you have scientists, one group of scientists may get precedent over another group of scientists who totally don't agree. But as that's pushed as the main thing, then we kind of almost conditioned to, and they come up with all of these like great figures. And you know, figures can be sort of manipulated. They can be, you know, just shown certain aspects. And you know, in principle, I'm with you all the way in terms of be skeptical about, be skeptical and trust science, but also know that, as you say, you need to hold your answers tentatively, and be aware that it might not be the right answer, because you know, scientists, there might be other scientists who disagree, who you haven't heard about.
For sure. The thing I'd like to say about that, to give you an example about science in the media as regards global warming, there is basically not a single peer-reviewed, like in a reputable journal, climate scientist. We have to remember that expertise does matter. Okay, so there's not a single peer-reviewed climate scientist coming out and questioning global warming. But if you look at what gets reported in the media, then you see out of something like 500 and some odd reports, something like 50% of them are mentioning skepticism about global warming. So basically there's an impression in the media of a controversy which is not reflected in the scientific consensus. And I agree with you definitely that science is always tentative, and so the thing we need to remember about science is that people tend to think science is about collusion, like it's, you know, groupthink. But in fact, that's not how science works. You don't get your name made in science by saying the same thing as somebody else. You get your name made in science by, like Einstein did, by revolution, by overturning. Okay, and this is actually part of what makes science great, is that instead of saying, this is my conclusion, now I'm going to go out and try to find the data to prove it. You start out with a hypothesis, and your goal is to falsify your own hypothesis, because if you don't, those other assholes are and they're gonna laugh at you when they do it. Because scientists, like everybody else, they have ego, they have bias. As individuals, they all have it. And so the thing is, you don't get the brass ring in science by just going along with the group. You get your brass ring by establishing something new, by contributing in a novel way, and by competing with your peers. It's why the claim that there is a vast collusion doesn't tend to hold water. And I can give you a very good example of something that sort of disproves this notion of collusion in science. Back in the 60s, the idea that smoking causes cancer was just beginning to become popular. Okay, and of course, I mean, you always say follow the money, right? The cigarette industry was pouring money, pouring influence, pouring everything they had against this conclusion. They were desperately trying to get the scientific community to deny it. Okay, they were even to the level of paying their own scientists to check it out. And the thing is, no matter how much money they poured into it, the consensus always beat them out. There were rogue scientists who were willing to come out and say and support them, but science tends to work by the aggregate. In other words, because individuals are biased, it has to kind of build up. It's sort of inductive, and it accumulates. But as the consensus accumulated more and more and more, there was no doubt. And there was a point at which nobody in science could even seriously say that smoking didn't cause cancer. And that was in spite of billions and billions of dollars on the part of the cigarette industry. And so there are definitely scientists who challenge the consensus. But you kind of have to look at how long the consensus, first of all, how big the consensus is. And that's not saying that like there's a democracy in science, but it's just sort of a statistical probability thing. If you have so many experts who tend to think a certain way, and you say, well, I disagree. If you're an expert, great. Then get off your ass and prove it. If you're not an expert, this is what Carl Sagan would call an extraordinary claim. To claim that I am better able than a vast consensus of experts to adjudicate on the veracity of a claim. And that's why when you hear something like, oh, there's a vast conspiracy of scientists, you kind of have to be skeptical, and you have to really double check again, and don't just, because a lot of times when we see these theories that tend to say to suggest a vast conspiracy, that also kind of lights up the circuit board. We kind of go, oh, wow. It's kind of like, you take the red pill and you just went down the matrix. Okay, but when you have that experience, you need to kind of resist that temptation and say, okay, I'm going to step back from this, and I'm going to really look into it, and I'm going to try to see, as many sources as I can, and compare them, and look into things like credibility when dealing with that kind of a challenge.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions. They're short. Do we have time?
Yeah, Lynn has a question also, so.
Okay, I will ask one question, and the other one I will ask outside. Can skepticism be skeptical about skepticism?
I think Michael Shermer provides a beautiful example of him being skeptical of himself. And I mean, he founded the skeptical movement, so to speak. He founded the skeptical movement in America. And he published the first major skeptical publication called Skeptic Magazine. And so him actually being able to look at the evidence and finally say, yeah, well, I hate to say it, I think that in a way is being skeptical of skepticism. And also, you always, I'll give you an example. Skeptics, like anybody else, they kind of have their celebrities, right? Like, I have a few guys that I tend to like. But I'm not going to believe something just because a skeptic tells me it's true. And so in that way, I guess I'm being skeptical of skepticism, because you don't want to just accept things on authority. It's kind of a tricky point, because you don't just accept things on authority, but at the same thing, expertise does matter, and consensus does matter. You kind of have to balance these two things. If somebody just says you should believe this because I'm an authority and I said so, then no. Whether this person is, the skeptic or the Pope or whoever. Now, if he's an expert, then I'm going to be a little bit more inclined to believe him. But I'm also going to look at what other experts say and kind of compare. And, do the majority of experts agree? It's kind of, again, it's inductive. It's kind of sort of a question of probability. You can never be, back from the time of the Greek skeptics, they used to say that you can never be absolutely certain of anything. Basically, that certainty is impossible. But then later on, when we began to establish a scientific method, we sort of realized, okay, we can't have certain truth, but we can sort of start to accumulate and get closer and closer. And you kind of, by going with the scientific consensus and going with the majority of experts, you sort of increase your probability of being on the right side. Whereas when you kind of make an extraordinary claim and say, oh, well, I'm not an expert, but, but I figured out, this or that, without really knowing that much about the science, then you're making an extraordinary claim. And then you definitely need to be skeptical of yourself. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, how specific You were saying that things, when you're talking about fortune telling or dream work, things aren't very specific. Like if I read this, most of this is something you can, most people feel this way. So it's going to target most people. They're going to come against me. But it's not very specific. Well, what if you have a skeptic? Here's an example. What if you have a skeptic and they have a dream? For example, that their bike has a flat tire. And then they don't ride it, and the next day they go to ride it, and it's like, damn, I've got a flat tire. And it happens exactly like that. And then they say to themselves, well, a few days ago, I rode over some glass. That's probably what it was. I was worried about the flat tire, and I thought, maybe I'll get it. Nah, it was the glass. And then they think, oh, but probably you did get hit by the glass. And that's the way that this skeptic explains that. Okay, that's what happened. I just had a dream about it because I was concerned about getting a flat tire, and therefore I did because of glass.
Sort of a post-hoc rationalization.
Right, but then taking it to the bike shop, they're like, oh, here's the culprit. It's a piece of metal. The skeptic might say, well, are you sure there's no glass in there? Then what's the next step to take after that? Like, what would the skeptic do with that? And is that not specific? I mean, would they have to look for more people that have these kind of situations, or would that just be, it's just coincidence? What a weird coincidence. That's just strange.
I think that's a really good question. I think basically you kind of need to say, well, it's just an anecdote. It's just in that particular case, it's one experience. It doesn't tell me, I can't really be certain one way or the other, right? You're right if you go and start to, as we say, post hoc rationalize, kind of special pleading, you try to figure a way out of it. That is definitely wrong. But the thing is, I think we also, one thing people need to remember is that to be truly scientific and open-minded, you need to be comfortable with uncertainty. Sometimes you need to just say, I don't know. But the thing is, you can't, what people do a lot of times is they say, well, I can't explain this. Therefore, it can't be explained. Therefore, we have proof of the supernatural. But the thing is, you can't use the fact that you can't explain something to prove something. It's sort of a logical contradiction. So the thing to do in your particular example, you really kind of can't do anything unless you want to set up an experiment, because what you need to do then is you need to control for bias, and you need to have a significant sample size, and of course, it's rather difficult. I can tell you, and this to prove my weaknesses. I had an experience just the other day that freaked me out. Okay, I went into my office. My coworker was sitting there. We didn't say a word to each other. Okay, and I know we didn't because I felt like there was an awkward silence, and I even kind of broke the awkward silence with something. I don't remember what I said, but she was really busy, and she didn't kind of say anything to me. And then I started humming the song "My Little Buttercup." My little buttercup is the sweet. I don't even remember how it goes exactly, but anyway, I started humming it, and I was like, God damn, why am I humming this stupid song? And she said to me, she goes, oh, did you watch The Three Amigos recently? And I said, God damn, no, I did not. But I said, that is a really good guess. How did you even possibly think of that? Because I didn't even remember that song was in Three Amigos. And she said, oh, I just watched it last night. And the first thing that jumped into my head was, I picked that right out of her head. I mean, what else could I say? I mean, how the hell? It's just like an incredible coincidence. And but then as you said, my skeptical tendency is to then sort of say, well, maybe I heard her humming, or maybe I did happen while I was flipping through I was channel surfing and I saw The Three Amigos and I just forgot about it. I just kind of started post-rationalizing. But I mean, the fact is, I don't really believe any of those excuses. I really don't know what to think. you know, except it was just a very odd coincidence. The thing about coincidences, though, that we do have to remember, and sorry, this is my skeptical bias, is we do have to remember that, like, over huge kind of numbers of experiences that we have day in, day out, and huge numbers of people, it becomes more and more probable that coincidences happen. I forget exactly how he puts it, but it's the chances of a specified person, for example, winning the lottery are incredibly low. It's like 1 in, I don't know how many million, right? Okay. But the chances of an unspecified person winning the lottery are 1 in 1. So the point is that all those other times that, like, no really weird coincidence occurred, of course, like I said before, you don't notice it because you don't notice things you don't notice randomness. You don't notice lack of connection. But when that connection hits, it's like the party, and you feel like, oh, someone's looking at me. Hey, right? It makes a much stronger impression. So for the rest of my life, I'm going to be talking about My Little Buttercup and the Three Amigos, right? Because that's just the way our minds are designed. But again, that doesn't prove that I didn't pull it out of her head. All it's saying is that by itself shouldn't convince me to go ahead and make that leap to saying that I did.
All right, good. And I'm sorry, but we're out of time, so let's thank Dan. Thank